The Ghost Roommate. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It wasn't easy to find a place with affordable rent in a decent area, let alone a roommate who seemed to have their life together. The ad I found online was straightforward. Room available in a two-bedroom apartment, spacious, clean, utilities included. The apartment itself was exactly what I was looking for, and the person offering the room, Alex, seemed polite and reserved, though a bit quiet. We moved in together a week later. Alex had already been living there for a while, so there wasn't much of a getting-to-know-you process. He mostly kept to himself, and I was fine with that. The apartment was nice and quiet, which I appreciated after long workdays. At first, everything seemed normal. We shared basic pleasantries, but our schedules were so different that we barely saw each other. Alex was always home whenever I returned from work, though he didn't seem to do much besides stay in his room. His door was usually shut, and while it struck me as a bit odd, I figured he was just a private person. He was a night owl, too. I would sometimes hear him moving around late at night, the sound of footsteps softly padding down the hallway. I figured maybe he worked remotely or had a night job. Either way, I didn't pry. After a few weeks, I started to notice some strange things. I never saw Alex during the day. I'd leave for work in the morning and his door would still be closed. I'd return in the evening, and while I could hear him in his room, he never seemed to come out during daylight hours. Even on weekends, when I spent more time at home, Alex stayed hidden behind his closed door. The only time I caught glimpses of him was after dark, when I'd pass by his room on the way to the kitchen or bathroom. I started to get a weird feeling, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just extremely introverted or worked night shifts. I told myself not to overthink it. Then things got even stranger. I began to notice that Alex was always in the same room when I wasn't looking. No matter how late I came home, he would already be in his room with the door shut, and I could hear faint noises, footsteps, the sound of furniture creaking, just enough to remind me that he was there. But he never came out to say hello, never joined me in the living room to watch TV, and I never saw him in the kitchen, despite food disappearing from the fridge. One night I came home later than usual after grabbing drinks with friends. The apartment was dark, as always, but something felt different about the atmosphere. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier, like something was watching me. I brushed it off as paranoia, but when I passed by Alex's door, I noticed it was slightly ajar for the first time. Curiosity got the better of me. I paused, my hand hovering over the door. Slowly, I pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The room was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a desk, and a few personal items. But there was no sign of Alex. The bed was neatly made, as if no one had slept in it. The air inside was cold, far colder than the rest of the apartment. I stood there, staring into the empty room, my heart racing. Where was he? I had heard him just minutes ago. I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. Something was very wrong. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I made my way to the building's office and asked the landlord if he knew much about my roommate. The man behind the desk looked puzzled. He pulled out a file with records on the apartment and flipped through it. "There's no one by that name listed for your unit," he said slowly, looking up at me. "In fact, there hasn't been a registered tenant there for years. You're the first renter in a long time." I felt a chill creep up my spine. That didn't make sense. Alex had been living there before I moved in. He had the lease ready when I arrived. But the landlord insisted. I asked if there were any previous tenants with a similar name, and he pulled out an old photograph from the archives. It was a black and white photo dated over 50 years ago. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it. There, standing in front of the building, was Alex, or at least someone who looked just like him. The photograph was dated decades before I even moved in. I stared at it, my mind racing. There was no way. It couldn't be the same person. That night, I stayed awake, waiting. Just after midnight, I heard the familiar soft footsteps in the hallway. I got up and opened my door, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was empty. Alex's door was slightly ajar again, and the cold air seeped out. When I checked, there was nothing. No sign of him. No sign that he had ever been there. The next morning, I packed my bags and moved out. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. My roommate wasn't human, and he hadn't been for a very long time. The haunted elevator. I'd been living in my apartment building for a few months when I first noticed something strange about the old service elevator. Most of the tenants avoided it, preferring the main one. It wasn't just that the service elevator looked old and run down. It had a reputation. I didn't know exactly why, but whenever I mentioned it to the neighbors, they would just shrug and say, "That thing has a mind of its own." At first, I didn't take it seriously. I figured it was just an outdated system. But it didn't take long for me to notice something odd. Every so often, I'd hear it moving at strange hours, midnight, 2 in the morning, when no one was around. I'd walk past, and the doors would slide open without anyone inside. Sometimes I'd hear it stopping on random floors with no one to call it. It was as if it was moving on its own, without purpose, like it was searching for something, or someone. One night I came home late, exhausted from a long day at work, only to find the main elevator out of order. Groaning, I turned toward the service elevator. The hallway was empty, and the dim lighting cast long shadows against the walls. As I pressed the button, I felt a strange unease. The elevator arrived with a loud metallic clunk, and the doors creaked open slowly. I stepped inside, staring at the old, worn buttons, some of which were barely legible. I pressed the button for my floor, but instead of the usual hum of machinery, the elevator groaned loudly, almost as if it was protesting. It lurched upwards, and for the first few seconds, everything seemed normal. Then, halfway up, it jerked to a sudden stop. There was no warning, just an abrupt halt, followed by complete silence. I pressed the buttons repeatedly, but nothing happened. The air inside felt unnaturally cold, and the small space suddenly felt much smaller. Then the lights went out. For a moment, I was plunged into total darkness. My pulse quickened, and I fumbled for my phone to turn on the flashlight. Just as I was about to switch it on, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the corner of the elevator. My breath caught in my throat. The whisper grew louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. Then, clear as day, I heard it. "Get out!" A wave of panic hit me. My fingers trembled as I jabbed at the buttons again, hoping for any response. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, casting harsh shadows across the walls. With a jolt, the elevator began to move again, but not in the way I expected. It didn't stop on my floor. Instead, the elevator kept ascending until it came to a stop on a floor I had never seen before. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. The walls were lined with peeling, faded wallpaper, and there were old, decrepit pieces of furniture scattered along the corridor, each covered with thick layers of dust. It looked like no one had been there in decades. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped out, taking in the eerie atmosphere. The air was thick with dust, and an unsettling quiet hung in the air, broken only by the faint hum of the elevator behind me. I cautiously moved down the hallway, noticing framed photographs hanging on the walls. The faces in the pictures were blurred, almost smeared, as if someone had tried to erase them. Every step I took echoed loudly, the sound magnified in the silence. I felt like I was being watched, but there was no one around. I reached the end of the hall, where a door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, the room looked abandoned, filled with more old furniture and personal items. But something about it felt wrong, like someone had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. I turned around and hurried back to the elevator, but as I approached, the doors slid closed. I pressed the button repeatedly, praying it would return. The whispering returned, growing louder and more insistent. It felt like it was all around me, coming from the walls, the floor, the air itself. My breath quickened as the elevator finally arrived, its doors opening slowly, as if reluctant to let me in. I jumped inside and slammed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed with a loud clang, and the elevator lurched downward. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't go out completely. The ride down was agonizingly slow, the elevator groaning with each floor. Finally, the doors slid open and I stumbled out, back in the familiar hallway of my building. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord. I told him what had happened, expecting him to brush it off as a bad dream. Instead, his face went pale. "That floor was sealed off years ago," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "After the fire. No one's supposed to be up there. It's been abandoned ever since." I never took the service elevator again. The new neighbor. I had just moved into my new apartment, thrilled to finally have a space of my own in the city. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom in an older building with creaky floors and outdated fixtures. But I didn't mind. I was excited for the fresh start. The building had character, and the rent was reasonable, so I didn't ask too many questions. My unit was on the third floor with a long hallway that stretched past several other apartments, most of which seemed empty. On my first day, while unpacking boxes, I met my landlord, Mr. Johnson, an elderly man with graying hair and a slight limp. He had been managing the building for over 30 years. I asked about my neighbors, and he mentioned the building wasn't fully occupied. When I inquired about the unit next to mine, he gave me an odd look. "That one's been vacant for years," he said, his tone flat. "Nobody's rented it in over a decade." I raised an eyebrow. "Why not? It looks fine from the outside." Mr. Johnson simply shrugged. "People come and go, but that apartment, well, folks who stay there don't tend to stick around long. It's best left alone." I didn't press him further, though his response left me curious. I figured the place was probably just run down and needed renovations. But after living there for a couple of weeks, things started getting strange. It was mostly at night when I noticed it. Faint sounds coming from the apartment next door. It wasn't anything too alarming at first, just the occasional creak or thud, which I chalked up to the building settling. But over time, the noises became more distinct. I could hear what sounded like muffled conversations, as if someone were speaking just on the other side of the wall. Other times, it was the unmistakable sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. One night, I even heard soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. The first time I heard it, I thought maybe someone had moved into the unit without my knowing. But when I asked Mr. Johnson about it, he reassured me that the apartment was still empty. "There's nobody in there, Paul," he said, his face serious. "Whatever you're hearing, it's not coming from that apartment." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. If no one was in the unit, then where were the sounds coming from? That night, as I lay in bed, I listened more intently. Sure enough, there it was again. The shuffling of feet, a chair scraping across the floor, and then knocking. A slow, deliberate knock. It came from the wall next to my bed, just a few feet away from where I lay. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the knocking continued. 3 steady thuds, each more deliberate than the last. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my phone, I decided to check out the neighboring unit for myself. If there was someone in there, I wanted to know. I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway and stood in front of the apartment next door. The door was old, the paint chipped and peeling. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, then slowly turned it. The door creaked open, and I was hit with a musty, stale smell. I stepped inside and flipped on the light switch. The overhead light flickered for a moment before buzzing to life, casting a weak glow over the room. The apartment was eerie. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. Dust covered every surface, but the furniture was all there. An old couch, a coffee table, and a kitchen with dishes still in the sink. There were personal items scattered around, a pair of shoes by the door, a coat draped over a chair, and a photograph on the mantel, the glass cracked, but the image still visible. It was of a man and a woman, smiling. The place felt frozen in time, untouched for years. But there was no sign of life. No one had been here in a very long time. Yet the noises I'd been hearing told a different story. As I walked through the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, silently observing me. I turned a corner into the bedroom, and that's when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. On the bed, neatly laid out as if someone had just left it there, was a set of clothes. A man's suit, dusty but intact, with shoes placed carefully beside it. There was no one in the room, but the clothes looked freshly arranged, as though they were waiting for someone to return. I backed out of the apartment slowly, my heart pounding. Before I left, I glanced at the door one last time and noticed something I hadn't before. A faint hand-drawn message on the wall near the entrance. It simply read, "He never left." I didn't stick around to figure out what it meant.